Welcome back, guys. My name is Martin Jones and this is P2 Corporate Reporting, and behind me is a number 7, a -7, a sausage 7, a 7 in a sausage. And you can see it's quite challenging to calculate that figure of -7. But once you have it, what do you do with it? Well, that's the easy bit. You guys, I imagine, are unfamiliar with ACCA, and therefore it might seem a bit intimidating to pick up this information, but I assure you by the time you get to the exam, it'll be like falling off a log. Getting the -7 will be the challenge, but once you've got the -7, what do you do with it? It's dead easy. Say the examiner will give you an OCE balance, so he'll have an OCE and other components of equity balance. Say, for example, just to make up a figure, he has a figure of 20. What you do is you copy his 20 and you go -7 equals 13. I mean, how hard's that? So you copy his 20 and then you go -7 gives you 13. Now, as it happens, in order to introduce OCE to you in a facsimile examination question, I've put OCE into the question Ronette, which is your homework question. It is actually a former exam question, but it's been adjusted to make sure it's just perfect for you guys, because obviously you're not ready for doing lease accounting and deferred tax and financial instruments just yet. So it's got all the the really rocket science stuff pulled out of it, but it's still pretty complicated. It's got complex groups, which is why it's in chapter 2. So parent by sub, sub by sub sub, and it has a goodwill impairment, and it's got a transfer as well. So let's have a look at the concept of the transfer and how it applies to the question Ronette. Now, actually, I've got Ronette just behind me, already ready to go. Pacha! There you go, you can see Ronette. Now, Ronette is in chapter 2. I reckon it's on page 23. And you can see what the examiner's done here. He goes all over the shop with these OCE balances, but this particular OCE balance, the parent OCE balance, is 300, and it's very unlikely one thing would go through the OCE, but if it was just one thing, then you would copy his 300. You go 300 -7 gives 293. All right. There'll probably be other things going through OCE as well in the examination, but basically that's what you do. Just pick up the -7, whack it into the OCE, make the OCE go down by 7. So actually moving this -7 to the appropriate place on the balance sheet, not so difficult, but getting the -7, that could do with a bit of practice. So I'm going to suggest we go fresh new brand new page and have a go at the next exercise. The next exercise is a repetition of the earlier exercise. There it is highlighted. So we did Iggy Pop, and now we're going to do Iggy Pop Parallel Universe. I'll just clean up the page a little bit. There we go. And then go in so we can really focus on the important stuff. So here we go. The important stuff being the percentages. At the year start, Iggy acquired 80% of POP for 200. At the year end, Iggy acquires a further 10%, so the ownership goes up from 80 to 90. So the NCI used to be 20%, and they've given us 10% of their 20%. They've given us half their ownership. So if we measure their ownership at the year end and take a half off them, leave them with 1/2 for themselves, then we will be measuring this process. Let's do it then. Iggy Pop. So the first requirement is just simple old goodwill. Off we go. So a different version of Iggy Pop, different numbers. Same logic but different numbers. Remember, the goodwill schedule lives at the point of acquisition, and in this question the point of acquisition is the year's start. So now we do the transfer where we measure the NCI at the year end in the morning before the transfer. Any NCI is always measured by the same process, which is roll forward. So 39 plus 20% of the growth. There's the growth. And the transfer is 10% of, 20% of, 41. Bit of a mouthful, that. Mathematicians would hate that kind of thing. But so for some reason it doesn't really offend me. I don't really mind. I did do quite a lot of maths before I did accounting. And it seems all right to me, I don't mind. So 10% to 20% is actually really a half. So we've got a half of 41 is a little bit awkward figure, 20.5. 20.5. So they keep their 20.5 and we take our 20.5. Then we have the effect on CI. No need for journals, remember. So the transfer is coming in. And that's 20.5. But the consideration is going out. And I can't remember the number. There we go, 29. So 8.5. Watch out for the sausage there, that's important, that's part of the marks. And you can see that does look substantially easier. Part of the reason, of course, it's looking easier is because of the repetition. But the main reason it's looking easier is because we've taken the journals out. They do add clutter. They do decrease the quality of the answer. They slow you down as well. So that's our 3 marks, assuming that's what the examiner gives. Maybe he'll give 4, maybe he'll give 3. And then we do the next one. So let's do the next one. So the next one, the final one, is Buster Rhymes. And again, we'll focus on percentages. At the year start, Buster acquires 90%. At the year end, Buster disposes of 15%, which is quite a big chunk. But does that lose control over the subsidiary? No. Of course, the remaining 75% is plenty sufficient voting power to continue to control the subsidiary. Therefore, this is a transfer. But the direction of this transfer is the opposite direction to the earlier ones. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a percentage model. We're going to use a percentage model. Now, the percentage model is in fact easier because all you do with the 15% is copy the 15%. There's no fancy proportion thing going on here. You just copy the 15%, which is easier. Buster Rhymes is easier, but actually it's far less frequently examined, which makes it much harder to remember. It's kind of harder because it's much less frequently examined. It's usually Iggy Pop that comes up, and Buster Rhymes definitely does come up, but just not as often, not nearly as often. So let me show you how this works. So final question. Buster Rhymes. A asks for goodwill again. Ooh, sorry. So we copy from the opening paragraph. There we go. By the way, just to remind you, a simple goodwill scores 2 marks. You can get up to 5 marks for goodwill. If there's a really complicated goodwill, you can get 5 marks. There was a really complicated one in the question. Cutchin, for example, that was given 5 marks, but usually it's 2, 3 or 4 marks for goodwill, for each goodwill. And it seems to be almost the law. The examiner has 2 subsidiaries. So that means that you can score anywhere between 4 and 8 marks is the usual thing. So it could be 4 marks if it's 2 really simple goodwills, and it could be 8 if it's 2 complicated goodwills. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I got a really sore throat. I don't know why. Not been doing anything. Teaching you guys. Really easy. In theory. You just copy the percentage and but what you multiply it by? That's really hard to remember. So practice this question a couple of times to make sure you can remember what you multiply it by. It isn't difficult to get this figure of the carrying value, but it's like, what do I multiply this by? It's the whole sub. So the sub is made up of people and things. Goodwill and net assets. Transfers are always at the year end, by the way. So we want the goodwill at the year end, which will be 300, because the goodwill won't have changed. But the net assets will have changed. They were what? They were 180 at acquisition, but they won't be that now. So let's read on down at the bottom there. At the year end, Buster disposes of 15% of the equity of Rhymes for 90, and so reduces its ownership to 75%. Rhymes has made profits and grown by 40 over the year, and therefore the carrying value of the identifiable net assets of Rhymes is 220 at the year end. So that's 220 at the year end. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm dropping everything. So what was that again? 220, wasn't it? 220, so 520. I'm not going to risk my brain against this. No, I can do that. 26 plus 52 is 78. Have I said that right? 26 plus 52. Yeah, 78. Yeah. So that's the transfer. But this time the transfer is out, at least from our point of view, it's out. Out. Transfer out, so that's a sausage, isn't it? And therefore the consideration, which always has the opposite sign, will be in, and I seem to remember it's 90. Yep. 90, giving us plus 12, increase to OCE. Your examiner's only consistency is his inconsistency. He usually gives that 4 marks. But most recently he gave it 3. But there's actually another mark for putting the OCE balance of 12 into the correct balance and making the balance go up. So just taking this one step further, imagine the examiner gives you a parent OCE of 100. You would copy his 100, you go 100 plus 12 gives 112. And that's where that component would end. Good stuff that, isn't it? So transfers. Transfers, really common, once, twice a year, something like that. Acquisitions and disposals in almost every single examination. Great, so really, really useful stuff. Now, that really naturally leads me to something I haven't looked at on this page here, and that is above the title is the chapter name. Basic groups. Now, there's a temptation to interpret that as easy groups, and I suppose that was true in the context of pedal, saddle, handlebar, but you can see that Iggy Pop is not easy at all. In fact, what I mean by basic groups is stuff that comes up in almost every examination. So acquisitions, disposals and transfers come up in almost every examination. They're really, really common. But the next chapter comes up every now and again. The next chapter is, whoops, sorry guys, complex groups. Let's go and have a go at complex groups then, perfect timing. So here we go, complex groups. in real life, complex groups can get really complex. But for the purposes of the examination, there's only really one possibility, and that's the vertical group. In vertical groups, the parent owns the sub, and the sub owns a sub-sub. And this is illustrated by the first question in this chapter. It's called ACR. Can you see it? ACR. A parent A buys 60% of entity C, which in turn buys 60% of entity R. So question A, C, R. So we've got A, C, R, where we have 60% and 60%. And the question is, what's the ownership split at the bottom? What's going on down there? Now we are the parent, the ultimate parent as it's often called, that fellow at the top. And what we're being asked is what is our ownership in R. Not what's C's ownership in R, but what's A's ownership in R. Called the controlling interest. Well, the controlling interest is 60% of 60%. Which gives us 36%. And therefore the non-controlling interest is 64%. There we go. Well, that's not very difficult. What's complex about that? Well, I haven't shown you yet what's complex about complex groups, but you've guessed it isn't the numbers. It isn't the numbers that's complex. So let's try again. Let's reinforce that idea with the question PDQ. So what happens in PDQ? So 75% of 64%. So the ownership split is CI has got 75% of 64%. Which is 48%. And the NCI is the rest, is the 52%. Well, that's not very difficult. No, you're right. It's not very difficult. What is difficult is this one little letter here. CI, controlling interest. Do we really have control with a minority vote? Well, what is the definition of control? The definition of control is the power to direct activities. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to try and see if you can see that this is quite complex. We control Q, and control is the power to direct activities. So we'll tell Q what to do. Now, when we tell Q what to do, we won't involve D. we'll just we P will just talk straight to Q, and we'll cut D out. Now, when we direct the activities, we'll either get a yes sir or a no. What happens if we get a no from Q directors, we being P directors? Then we get D involved. And we tell D, sack Q. Can D sack Q? Absolutely. D can sack Q, of course, because D has 64% of the votes. But what if D argues about sacking Q? What will we do with D? We'll sack D. If anyone argues, we'll sack them, and therefore we have control. And there you go, you see, so control is the power to direct activities and isn't majority ownership. So these non-controlling interests, what the non-controlling interests are, is they're an interest that doesn't have control. But this majority that looks like a majority really is a majority, you're not imagining it. And that's what's complex about complex groups, really. I mean, that's the main thing that's complex about complex groups. And just to, give you an idea of the complexity and how easy it is to make mistakes in this area. See if you can answer this question. Does D control Q? Yes or no? Does D control Q? Yes or no? Punnet's gone for an answer. Yomba's gone for an answer. Welcome, Yomba. Anyone else prepared to guess? Well done, Humayun. The answer is no. D does not control Q because D doesn't even control itself. Oh yeah. D is a subsidiary. It doesn't even have control of itself, let alone control over Q. D doesn't decide how to vote in Q. D doesn't decide how to vote in Q. D doesn't decide what to do with its own votes. P decides what to do with D's vote. Oh, that's right. That's that's very good. Humayun, very, very good. That's a trick question, isn't it? Because it doesn't half look like D has control over Q. D has a controlling interest, or no, you can't say that, as a majority interest, but doesn't actually have control because it doesn't even control itself. Here's another hard question. It shows you the complexity of complex groups. How many shares does P have in Q? How many shares does P have in Q? How many shares does P have in Q? I'm certainly proving that this is more complex than it looks. Only Punnet is prepared to guess. The percentage is 0. We have no shares. It's there. You can see it when you look at it. It goes like, obviously. What we have is we have shares in D, and D has shares in Q. And the number of shares that we have in Q is 0. It is complex, isn't it? These complex group structures. And when I think about it, oh yeah. Yeah, that's right. We don't have any shares in Q. All we have is we have ownership in something that has ownership. So that's the kind of complex stuff about complex groups, not bashing the numbers. The numbers just drop out in the way that you can see. All right, that's enough having fun with that. But going back to the question, you'll see that there's a rather strange reference in this question, and that is to the UK stream. And basically, it's just as a little opportunity for me to warn you about streams. There are two main streams available at the ACCA. They're the international stream and the UK stream. Now, you want the international stream. Unless you've got very, very special particular needs, then you want the international stream. So why am I warning you away from the UK stream? Well, every single sitting, a student writes to me just before the exam and realises that they've accidentally fallen into the UK stream. If you accidentally fall into the UK stream and you leave it until the last minute, then you'll be doing the UK exam. And the UK exam is genuinely a pain in the backside. There are a number of different systems within the United Kingdom. So depending on how you measure it, there are 5 different systems within the United Kingdom. So in order to do the the IFRS, the international paper, you need to know IFRS. In order to do the UK paper, you need IFRS and the other 5 streams, which means you need to know goodwill 6 different ways, deferred tax 6 different ways, financial instruments 6 different ways, cash flow statement 6 different ways. It's a massive, massive jump up. The slightly compensating thing is the number of UK marks in the examination is only around about 15, but still, because the syllabus doesn't double, it more than doubles. It's a massive jump up in commitment, and you don't want to accidentally end up in the UK stream. But why would you accidentally end up in the UK stream? It's just one of those things that, unfortunately, the ACCA computer, if you don't make an active vote for international, as I understand it, if you don't make an active vote in the ACCA when applying for your paper, it'll automatically default you into the UK stream. So if you have already applied for your examination, what I'd like you to do is, when I click off now, go and have a look on your phone, go and have a look on your computer and see which stream that you have applied for. That's what I want you to do. That's the reason for that. So when I click off in half an hour from now, what I'd like you to do is just to double check that you've got the right stream for your application, for your examination. All right? Between now and the end, what we need to do is D. Lovely question. Now, D is called D because it represents a D group. This is what's called a pure vertical group, but there's a pollutant that the examiner sometimes examines. And it's called a D structure, and you'll see why in a moment. It's because it has that structure. The parent does have some direct ownership in I. And the reason this is called a D group is because it looks like a D, of course. Now that's the most complex group that you can have. Either you'll have a pure vertical or you'll have a D group. And it's really useful knowing the limitation of what can be examined at P2. Especially when you're given sentences like this. At the year start, in the morning, D acquired 75% of Mersey and 25% of Irwell. So we get 75% and 25%. On the same day, in the afternoon, Mersey bought 40% of Irwell. Mersey bought 40%. Now, this extra complexity in complex groups introduces some extra language. The extra language is direct and indirect. The direct ownership of D in I is 25%. The indirect ownership is the ownership of D in I through M. It's the 75% of 40%. It's 30%. And that gives a controlling interest of 55% and a non-controlling interest of the other 45%. There we go. Oh, but hang on, wait a second. There is also an ownership split in the mid-sub as well. There's actually two subs here. we've got 75% of M, therefore the controlling interest is 75% and the non-controlling interest is 25%. But here's an interesting question. That's the first time you've drawn up a group structure for a while. Why is it that we so rarely use group structures here at P2? The answer is very simple. If you have a simple group structure, it's best not to do one because there are no marks. There's absolutely no marks for what I just did up there. So why did I do what I did up there? Well, I feel like I can't make any progress with this question unless I get the group structure sorted. And it's not just parent by sub and parent by sub. It's parent by sub and sub by sub-sub. I mean, I can't do these figures in my head. So in order to manage this information, I do need this group structure. But I only do a group structure myself personally when the group structure gets complex. If it's not complex, then I just skip the structure because there are no marks for a group structure. Your first marks are for the net assets. We're going to measure at acquisition, at year end, and thereby get the growth. For the first subsidiary, M, and at acquisition, and at year end, and thereby get the growth. For the second subsidiary, I. And we're going to do this by measuring the share capital and the retained earnings at the appropriate measurement points. First of all, let's get that relevant information from the balance sheet. I've copied across the share capital because the share capital freezes at acquisition. But now I need the retained earnings. There they are, 100 and 150. You certainly don't have to do it like this, but I find that sticking the two subs side by side really works for me. So we've got all the information we need to know about percentages up there in the group structure diagram. I remember that the first sub has got an ownership split of 75-25. But I can't remember, was it 55-45, wasn't it? But that 55 up in controlling interest has got two components, and it is again very wise to split out the 55 as 25 and 30. Squeeze those in, 25 and 30, like that. So you've got them on the same line. Good stuff. And then, of course, the whole reason of working those numbers was to drop them in as appropriate. Then we copy the NCI. And we copy the consideration. Now this is where we start to earn our chops. That 200 is clearly the investment of D in M, so that's fine. That 200 is clearly the investment of D in M. But you can see that there are two figures on the I line. One, the first one, represents the direct investment, whereas the second one represents the indirect investment. So we copy the 70 without too much thought. There it goes there, nice and tight. But then we ask this rather strange question. How much did we spend when the other guy spent 80? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we are D and we didn't spend any of that 80. That was spent by our buddy M. So is the fair value consideration 0 then? Doesn't sound quite right. Wait a second. M is our 75% subsidiary. And that 80 that was invested in I was cash that went out of a bank account over which we had control. We told M to go and buy I. But because we told M to go and buy I, they spent 80. And of that 80, 60 belonged to us. And that felt just as bad as if we had spent 60 ourselves. When our 75% subsidiary spends 80, we spend 60. Meaning that our 55% ownership cost us 130. That's the tricky thing, isn't it? But you might be surprised to hear that when that is examined, most students get the red fella right. It's not particularly easy, is it? But it perhaps isn't rocket science either. Let's just check it again. When you're checking it, it's easiest to check it actually on the balance sheet, in the question. And I'll do that again in exactly the way that I did just a moment ago. Just say exactly the same thing, but reinforce the ideas. So we've got a 75% ownership in this dude M. And we tell this dude M to spend 80. We could have told them to spend it on a dividend. And if M had paid a dividend, then it would have paid a dividend to its shareholders. Of the shareholders, we have 75%, so we would have received 60. But we're never going to get that 60 as a dividend because it's been spent. So the cost of the investment of M in I cost us 60. Every time our 75% subsidiary spends $1, we spend 75 cents. It's actually, it's not just the investment in shares that have this relationship, it's actually all investments. So every time that M spends $1 on stock, we spend 75 cents. Every time that M spends $1 on property, we spend 75 cents. So it's on everything. It's not just this shares thing. You just don't really notice it. But what goes around comes around. Every time that M makes $1, we make 75 cents. So that, that's what it is to have a 75% subsidiary. So this entity has just spent 80, so that's the same as us spending 60. And you know, that's it isn't rocket science. But this last little bit at the bottom, it is a bit tricky. And it's called the indirect adjustment, and I introduced it to you, at least its name, last time that we were together. And last time that a complex group came up, I marked 110 scripts. 55 of them managed to get the red fella, which is half of them, which is pretty good, isn't it? And one of them got the indirect adjustment. So if everybody's getting it wrong, you can get it wrong as well. But if you want to get it right, there's one mark, there's a mark for it. And it's the thing that you do at the bottom of the balance sheet. What we've just described there, by multiplying 75% against the 80, by multiplying the 80 by 75%, what we just described there could be described as logic. And there's a lot of logic to what we're doing here. When our 75% subsidiary spends $1, we spend 75 cents. So when it spends 60 grand, when it spends 80 grand, we spend 60 grand. Yeah, fine. But there's another form of mechanics that happens in accounting, and that's double entry. And we have to pick up the double entry thing by multiplying by 75%. We've knocked 25% off the top of the balance sheet. You know, if you've got 80 apples and you only keep 60 and you throw the rest away, how many do you throw away? 20, right? So if you've got 80 apples and you keep 75% and you throw away 25%, how many do you throw away? You throw away 25%. Well, that's fine with apples, but we're not doing apples. What we're doing is accounting on a thing called a balance sheet. If you throw 20 off the top of the balance sheet, you have to throw 20 off the bottom of the balance sheet. Otherwise, your balance sheet won't balance. And in real life, you do have to do that. But in the examination, you completely ignore it if you want to, because your balance sheet's not going to balance anyway. What's the chance of that happening? Absolute zero. But if you actually do want to get this right and score the full 2 marks for the NCI, then you do have to pick up the fact that as we are multiplying the 80 by 75%, what we're doing is we're throwing away 20. When we multiply by 75%, we're reducing the population by 25%, so we're throwing 25% of 80 off the top of the balance sheet. To balance the balance sheet, we have to throw 25% of 80 off the bottom of the balance sheet as well. And that second thing is called the indirect adjustment. And you can see that second thing, that really is pretty tricky. Okay, so we're probably over-focusing on the one difficult mark here. Let's just relax again and go back into bashing numbers. So let's go back into bashing numbers. So adding down, we've got, how do I do this? What's the easiest way? 160. Is it 53? Must be an easier way than the way I just did that then. So that's what's that? 130, 210, 53. It is 53. Yep, 53. And then we whack that onto the balance sheet, because this is a real question now. Group balance sheet or group position statement is the phrase I like. So we have goodwill. Oops. Made it look like 2 words. Goodwill of, why did I squeeze it in like that? I have no idea why I did that. So 142 plus 53 gives 195. And then net assets. It's surprisingly easy to misread this figure, so I'll highlight it for you. We have absolute control of all the net assets at the year end. I'll get rid of those lines because they're very distracting. We have absolute control of 600, 112, 180. 600, 112, 180. which is 2, 8, 1, oh, what, 9, 1, 2, 8, 9, 2. In the exam, you add across, but not down, because there are no marks for adding down. But here, just to give ourselves the satisfaction, we will add down into the bottom of the balance sheet. We pick up the parent share capital of 100. Then the retained earnings. And the non-controlling interest. How much space have I got? Not much. I'll go fresh new brand new page, I think. So the retained earnings are based upon the parent and the 2 sub-growths. M and I. So the parent had profits in its reserve of 770. And the growth of these 2 babies was 72 and 20. (72 and 20), and our ownership of those was 75% and 55%. So 36 plus 18, or 18 of this, is that 50? How do you do this? 54? So 54? And 55% of 20 is 11. So that's 5, 12, 3, 8, 3, 5. And then the NCI. Starting to look a lot more like an exam question now, because you always have 2 subsidiaries. So we get this repetition, which is nice, you know, because it gives you extra marks. There's the roll forward first. Oops. There's the roll forward first. So acquisition subgrowth for M, and then acquisition subgrowth for I. Hopefully getting really familiar now the more we repeat this. So it's 62 plus 25% of 72. 62 plus 25% of 72. 62 plus 72. And same kind of deal with the other guy. 83 plus 45% of 20. And then you have the 2 I's at the bottom of NCI, the 2 I's. The impairment adjustment and the indirect adjustment. The impairment, we see chapter 1 and the fabulous question we did together in the afternoon last time we were together. That question, terror. And it's not applicable here. An impairment comes up regularly. It's in, 12 twice a year, 3 times a year, almost every exam. And the indirect adjustments, it's relatively rare, you know. I'm surprised indirect should be examined more often, I think, but it just isn't. It's examined every couple of years, every 3 years, something like that. So not that often, to be honest with you. Perhaps every couple of years, but that's still only once every 8 exams, so not that often. There you go, it's just the way it is. And the indirect adjustment works like this. You go and have a look at the red fella, if you can remember. You go and have a look at the red fella, and you say, hang on, I just multiplied the 80 by 75%. That means I knocked 25% off. I knocked 25% off. So I'm going to knock off 25% down here. So the indirect adjustment, which is actually happening in M, is 25% of 80, which is 20. I'm balancing the balance sheet by knocking off a corresponding figure in the bottom of the balance sheet corresponding to the equivalent figure up in the top of the balance sheet. So 62 plus 18 plus 83 plus 9 minus 20 is 152. So we have 152. Okay, 152. 152. And 835 for the retained earnings. 835 for the retained earnings. So 8, 3, 5, 1, 5, 2, 7, 8. Whoa! 1087. And the balance sheet balances. What's the chances of that happening in the examination? Absolute zero. Well done, guys. You've finished groups, essentially. All right, I admit it. There's a bit more to learn next time we're together. In particular, next time we're together, we're going to have to learn this very separate feeling thing called the group cash flow statement. And that'll be the main thing that we do together next time, you know, next week. Next week it is, isn't it? But also we have to look at, you probably knew this was coming, we've got to look at foreign subsidiaries as well. So foreign subsidiaries and cash flow statements, but both of those I think you can compartmentalise. What you've done already so far in these 2 lectures covers the vast majority of what gets examined in the examination. So you know what I'm going to say, your homework is to redo what we did together until they become easy. So the pop stars and question D that you can see over my shoulder, redo these until they become easy. Going to the slides now. What am I doing? Oh, silly me. Going to the slides now. Pacha! There you go. You can see, oh, sorry guys, didn't mean to do that. Going to the slides now, you can see reference over there to the question Ronette. That's your homework question from chapter 2, Ronette. Oh, and by the way, there's detailed answers in the back. Okay, there's detailed answers in the back. But don't forget, Hebrides, also with very, very detailed answers in the back of the class notes. So Hebrides and Ronette, you're very welcome. I would like to see you emailing your answers to me. You can photograph them, but you know, in terms of actually working on these answers and figuring out what's going on, clearly, you know, you've got to look at my answer, haven't you? So my answers, they're in the back of the class notes. In the class notes at the back are the answers to all the exercises, including Hebrides and Ronette. So I want you to, you know, do those questions over and over again until they become easy. But I do like seeing your homework when you send it through to me. I won't say very much. I'll just say something like, well done, and give you a thumbs up. But nevertheless, it gives me confidence that you're actually doing some work, because the truth is that P2 can really catch up with you if you leave it all till the last minute. It'll be a catastrophe and you'll just have a really stressful August and September. But if you keep these things ticking over, it's still going to be hard, but it's going to be far less stressful when you get into August. So practice your Hebrides, practice your, what did I call the other one? Ronette. And I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.